going their ways to find a seat. I'm not so sure about my introduction now. I mean, I'm going to say, like, I'm the Reverend Stephen Cole. I'm a professor here at the... Wait, is there anybody who doesn't know that here? Maybe the vast multitudes online watching live streamed and on to posterity as this is captured as a video. Will need to know that I teach religion and philosophy at the college here. I was a pastor for 22 years after graduating from the theological school upstairs here. But my primary claim here to be speaking today on the subject to which I will address myself is that I've been a fan of the new philosophy and the Swedenborg Scientific Association for many years, going back to my college days, as a matter of fact. I've been a member for a long time and have been on the board for, I don't know, 15 to 20 years now, I guess. So I'm a fan, I'm a supporter. What I was prepared to address was that we might have people who were the fans of Swedenborg's philosophy and those who might not be. So there's my subtitle, 100 Years of the Swedenborg Scientific Association. Now, part of the problem is that's sort of poetic license. It's actually more like 120 years. As a matter of fact, 1917 is really the 120th anniversary, birthday of the Swedenborg Scientific Association. And not just looking back, so far, but also to its contributions to a new world of ideas, which we hope is at present and even more so in the future. So, this is for fans of Swedenborg's science and philosophy, but it's also, I want to allow for the fact we may have people who need to be convinced that there's any point to looking at Swedenborg's science and philosophy, and beyond that, even if you're not convinced that there's still a role for the Swedenborg Scientific Association and the new philosophy. So, both of those prongs. Now, I said 100 years... and maybe stretch that to 120, but as if that's not enough to try to cover, I'm going to go back 300 years. Where does that get us? That would be about 1717, wouldn't it? Okay, so what are we going to try to cover? The prehistory of the Swedenborg Scientific Association, Part 1. Swedenborg himself. How can you have a Swedenborg Scientific Association without a Swedenborg? And then 2, after Swedenborg, but before the Swedenborg Scientific Association itself got rolling. That's most of the 19th century. I'm not going to say a lot about that, but I do want to touch on it. It's the backdrop. And then on to the founding of the Swedenborg Scientific Association. Note, SSA is here representing the Swedenborg Scientific Association, not to be mistaken for the Social Security Administration. If you want to talk on that, you better go someplace else. An interlude. This is the pitch for what's interesting about the science and philosophy, and then on to a brief sketch of early work of the Swedenborg Scientific Association, and a brief look at what's been happening in the more recent history, what might be happening now, and on into the future. That's our roadmap for the presentation overall. Okay, back then to the prehistory that deals with Swedenborg. So, Swedenborg lived from 1688 to 1772. It looks like I may have gotten my dates here wrong because... there we go. This thing doesn't work on that. At the end there, it says 1771. And that's the year Swedenborg published the last theological work, The True Christian Religion. And so that's where I'm talking about the stuff he published during the theological period, and not right up to his last year, which was only a year later. But there's the broad scope of Swedenborg's life. This is commonly divided at least once, maybe twice, to say, well, there was his childhood and education, then there was his scientific and philosophical period, and then there was his theological period. And sometimes people will speak about an intermediate period which runs from 1745 to 1748 or 49. He started writing the Arcana Celestia in 1748 at the end of the year, and he published it in 1749. So that's a clear demarcation of the beginning of a theological period. He's doing some theological stuff in between the worship and love of God, the Index Biblicus, etc. But that he never published any of that, so people tend to call that intermediate when he's preparing, he's ramping up for publishing the theological works. Okay, so getting into Swedenborg's, well, one more note here, scientific philosophical, that's more a modern distinction. Back in Swedenborg's day, what we would presently call natural scientists were called natural philosophers. So we can try to draw a boundary between science and philosophy and theology, but it's really hard to lay down the line between science and philosophy in this day. Swedenborg wasn't the only one who was blending over from one to the other. And I think I'll note how that shows itself in his works in just a little bit here. One of the first things Swedenborg actually published was Sweden's first scientific journal. Now, again, here's another division we might want to make. There is science and there is technology. And here also, we don't really have a clear boundary. People who did science did technology. People who did technology did science or natural philosophy. Swedenborg was doing both of these kinds of things. A lot of his focus at this point was more on technology. He was an inventor. He was making contraptions for various sorts of things in the mining industry, in the shipping industry, etc. So this is one of the things we get elaborated in this scientific journal. This is also where we find Swedenborg's first little science/philosophical essay. There's a piece of what is called the tremulation in this. And I suspect that hardly anybody, if anybody's going to be able to read at the bottom there, the date on that is 1716. So 301 years ago, Swedenborg launched Sweden's first scientific and technological journal. Well, I'm going to fast forward because Swedenborg is doing similar sorts of things. He is on his day job. His occupation is actually being on the Board of Mines. So he's very much focused on the mining industry, which was Sweden's major industry at the time. That was Sweden's economy, was all about mining. And so Swedenborg not only sits on the Board of Mines, but he writes about it. Now, the first volume of a 3-volume set was called the Principia, or the Principia of Natural Things, the Principles of Natural Things. This was, as I say, the first of 3 volumes of his Opera Mineralia et Philosophica, his mineralogical and philosophical. He says it himself. He's doing both things. And the first volume is much more philosophical, but it does get into the cosmology and the mineralogy even there. But then there's a volume on iron and a volume on copper. And that's very technical and scientific, as we would call it today. So that's what I was talking. That's what I said I would be touching on, how Swedenborg goes from one to the other. So this one begins with a chapter on the means conducing to the true philosophy. What is it to be a true philosopher? And by the time we're done, we're talking about mineralogy and mining and that kind of thing. So from philosophy to science to technology, you could say. And again, I say this part of his life is called his scientific and philosophical, but again, there's a division here where he's looking more at mineralogy and cosmology, and then after this, there is a shift. While he is seeing this massive 3-volume work through the press, he's talking to his publisher about the sad state of the world, the atheism that seems to be growing and is rampant in some quarters. And what are we going to do about this? How can we address this? So he dashes off in the course of about a month a little work, often called The Infinite. I also brought my, I'm kind of a little abashed to wave this around. This is a facsimile of the first volume of the opera, the Principia volume. But it's sad because the real thing is about this tall. It's a very impressive set of volumes. And the picture we have here of Swedenborg, I'm not sure you could call this the only authorized portrait of Swedenborg, but this is the portrait he allows to be printed in the beginning of this volume. So we might suppose this may be what Swedenborg thought he actually looked like. Or he may have just said, oh, well, that's a terrible likeness, but go ahead anyway. Then he published this little thing, and this is an actual first edition of this work. And I don't know if you can read the words infinito, but there it is there. De infinito et causa finale creationis. The infinite and the final cause of creation. Final meaning that which is end-driven, looking towards a goal. And also concerning the mechanism of the operation of the soul and the body, which also might come in handy for later. That he's also talking about that at this point. This is what he's after from this point forward during the balance of his scientific and philosophical era. He's interested in the connection of the soul and the body. So he focuses a lot on the body, but what he's looking for is evidence of the connection with the soul. But this is just a little, well, he actually, I don't think I even mentioned that. I know I didn't mention that part. A prodromus, which is a fancy Latinate word. I mean, it's actually a Latin word for a forerunner for a rational philosophy. And so he very much, right there on the title page, is saying, this is just anticipating what I hope will come. And one of the first fruits of that, as far as an actual published work, was his so-called economy of the animal kingdom. I have an English translation thereof here from the 19th century, and I have it here more as an illustration of the 19th. Economy of the Animal Kingdom. Unfortunately, two of Swedenborg's major works, that one and the next one that followed, have these: the Animal Kingdom, Zoology. No, here is the new title on this volume, and you can buy it outside in the Commons there. The Dynamics of the Soul's Domain. It's actually the same translation. It's just reprinted from that, but they put a more user-friendly title at the top. Dynamics, and the next one is called now The Soul's Domain rather than The Animal Kingdom. But that's what he's doing at this point. He publishes the two aforementioned 1734 works, and then in 1740 he publishes the first volume of this Economy of the Animal Kingdom, and then a few years later he's publishing the Animal Kingdom or the Soul's Domain. These are about the human body. First, more general principles: the brain, the blood, the circulatory system, the nervous system, that kind of thing. And then the other one is much more particular. It's going into specific organs of the body, because he figures he needs maybe to build from the bottom up, from the particulars to the generals. But before that project is even finished, he has his so-called spiritual crisis. The Lord appears to him and commissions him to a new line of work. Now, if you know the timeline of Swedenborg's life, or if you were paying attention to those numbers up there when I had the years up there, this I like to characterize as Swedenborg's retirement project. He is actually 60 years old before he starts writing the Arcana Celestia. So it's not like Swedenborg spent a decade or two of his life doing science and philosophy and then spends the rest of his life doing theology. I don't want to say in any way it's an afterthought, but it's like he's had a productive professional career. And as he turns 60, he shifts to publishing the theological works and continues to publish other things. One of the earliest things Swedenborg wrote and published was a method for finding the longitude. And if you know about the big longitude problem, that's great, and you'll understand why that was important. And if you don't know, I'm not going to explain it today. If nothing else, I can point you to an article where, in the New Philosophy, by my grandmother, Wirtha Pendleton Cole, who explains what Swedenborg's method was and why it was an important issue in his day. Enough said on that, other than the fact I wanted to point out he continued to try to republish this thing and put it before the public as late as 1769, 3 years before he died, 2 years before the True Christian Religion, long into 20 years into his career of publishing theological works. He's still publishing his own stuff, little bits and pieces, no major works, but his work on finding longitude, he's still trying to get people interested. So he never lets up on his scientific and philosophical interests. He just sort of he lets up some, but he never gives up on them. It's always part of his thinking and his life. Okay, that was the Swedenborg part. So when did Swedenborg do scientific and philosophical stuff? He did it up until at least 1745 in his life. So that's where this stuff that people are interested in, these kind of things, that's what they're looking at. Yes? I'll take questions now. I'll take questions later, anytime you like. Yeah? Yes, that would be great to clarify. Anima is the word for soul. As a matter of fact, right here I have a book, probably improperly titled De Anima, which is later, well, actually, here is Frank Sewell's translation, The Soul, or Rational Psychology, which is a translation of this. By the time Alfred Acton, whom we shall get to, was translating this, he simply called it The Rational Psychology, feeling that was a more fitting title for the work. But Aristotle had a work, De Anima, and it's kind of a big deal. So anima is soul, and in typical Latin fashion, you form an adjective out of that, anima animalis, of or pertaining to the soul. Well, it may not have been a mistranslation at some point in the history of the English language, but for people today, it's a pretty significant, and economy as well. We now think dollars and cents. Maybe some of us date so far back, dare I say, as to when one of the genders who shall remain nameless studied home economics, which simply meant the running of a household. It didn't have anything to do with keeping the books or balancing the checkbook. It comes from the Greek word oikos, which means the household and a proper running of the household. So the household of the soul's domain, the right ordering, the right running thereof. And what's that? That's dynamics. That's a little bit looser, a little further from the original concept, but it does it better justice at this day than the word economy does. Good? Question answered? Great. Okay, now I would say not only Swedenborg, other people were using, this wasn't some peculiar expression Swedenborg came up with. Other people wrote about the regnum animale. So it wasn't just, everybody knew what that meant back in Swedenborg's day. It meant the kingdom of the soul. Oh, right. So this is the first one, the dynamics of the soul's domain, as we now call it. And that wraps up the what I wanted to say about the prehistory Swedenborg part, the 18th century part, you might say. Now I want to move on to the 19th century portion. Well, there was actually a lull in interest in Swedenborg's science and philosophy from his death to about the middle of the 19th century. People who were interested in Swedenborg, people who were interested in what he had to say, were mostly focused on the theological works, which is probably a good thing. They were translating them into various modern European languages, English in particular, but also into German and French. They were publishing some of the manuscripts that Swedenborg had left, manuscripts on theological subjects, and that was plenty for these people to be focused on and devoting their efforts to. But along about the middle of the 19th century, people became more interested in A, the works that Swedenborg had published on the scientific and philosophical topics, and B, on some of the unpublished manuscripts Swedenborg had left behind, which on these topics which hadn't yet been published. He left the manuscripts behind, no publication. So among those were two massive works on the brain, which have since been published as The Cerebrum and the Brain. Of course, they've got exactly the same title in Latin, De Cerebro, but because there was a later work called De Cerebro, Codex 55 in the manuscript collection, published by Toffel under the name The Brain. Excuse me, I should say Rudolf Leonard Toffel, R.L. Toffel, The Brain. This is just one of 2 volumes, and these 2 volumes are only half of what he originally intended to publish. It was going to be like that on the shelf. And then along comes Alfred Acton about 50 years later saying we ought to publish his first work. Well, we won't call it The Brain. That would be too confusing. We'll say something that's more like the Latin title. We'll call it The Cerebrum. It doesn't just mean the cerebrum, though. It means the whole brain. Okay. So how did this stuff get rolling? Well, I mentioned Rudolf Leonard Toffel because the next thing I want to do is talk about his uncle, J.R. F.R. Emanuel, Johann Friedrich Emanuel Toffel, commonly called Joe Freem by people in the business. I mean, not at his time. I don't think anybody would have called him that to his face. I waved around De Anima. This is one of the first of Swedenborg's unpublished scientific and philosophical manuscripts to be published by this guy. He's there. See, J-O-F-R-I-M. Looks like Joe Freem, doesn't it? Back in those days, there were 4 of these guys, 4 of these Toffel brothers. 2 of them became earnest, energetic workers in the vineyards of the new church. Joe Freem and his brother Leonard, who came over to this country. 2 of Leonard's sons, Rudolf Leonard Toffel and Louis Hermann Toffel, became founders of the academy. You can find their names on the charter. So that was the American branch of the family. Emanuel Toffel, as he probably should be more properly called, stayed at home in Germany. He was the librarian of the University of Tübingen, but he published piles of stuff, not just the scientific and philosophical. He published second editions of many of the theological works in Latin as well. Well, they're still in Latin, and this De Anima is in Latin, so it hasn't actually made its way out into the English-speaking public very far. So that's the next thing that happens is people begin to translate some of the Swedenborg's published scientific and philosophical works and also some of his unpublished manuscripts now published posthumously. So there's the one I was just showing you, De Anima. And now we come to one of the first translators of this sorts of works, James John Garth Wilkinson. Sounds like it ought to be an A.A. Milne poem or something, doesn't it? He was very well connected. He knew everybody who was somebody, not only in England, but he corresponded with Emerson and William James and these kinds of people. So what did he do? He did things like, I already waved this one around, The Economy of the Animal Kingdom. Wait a minute, that's a Clissold. The Animal Kingdom is the Wilkinson one. Or the Soul's Domain, and this is also Clissold, I think, the Principia from 1840. Where did the title page? It doesn't. 1849, I think, is the first English. 1846, first English translation of the Principia. So these guys, middle of the 19th century, are beginning to be interested in Swedenborg's scientific ideas, his philosophical ideas, and doing some work on it, publishing them in English. So that sort of sets the stage for the founding of the Swedenborg Scientific Association. Late 19th century, 1897. There is a group in Chicago studying these works. They call themselves the Principia Club. And they began to see the need to have an organization for promoting these things, for studying these things, for doing ongoing publication of Swedenborg's work. So this is getting more organized in this department than anybody has been to this point. First president was the Reverend Frank Sewell. Anybody know anything about him? He was a prominent convention minister, and the fact that he was a convention minister is a point I want to get back to. But you have heard his name within the last 5 or 10 minutes, because I said the first translation of the rational psychology, actually called The Soul, is Frank Sewell's translation. How did you not all remember precisely that was the guy? That's the guy. So that's the book as published by him, and it's got a lengthy introduction. He writes about Swedenborg and how Kant stole all kinds of ideas from Swedenborg. Maybe I shouldn't say that for posterity, but the relationship of Immanuel Kant's ideas to those of Swedenborg, and he touches on that in the beginning of this the introduction to this book. So prominent in convention, he was the pastor of the National Church in Washington, D.C. He was invited to speak before Congress. So he was a big deal in his time. And he's also, you've seen his name, whether you realize it or not, most people in the general church have seen his name when they sing the Easter hymn, Morn of Joy and Morn of Praise. He was also a hymn writer. So he wrote words and music for that hymn. Anyway, I could go on about the liturgical side of Frank Sewell as well, but that's not our present topic. He's a fascinating fellow. Well, what is important about this? Why would people be interested in Swedenborg's this period of Swedenborg's life? Here's where the interlude comes, and I've got a lot of slides here. So, looking at Swedenborg's life and looking how things fit together, here we go with the numbers again. I've got a question mark because I'm talking about what came before Swedenborg. What's he looking at himself? So here we have the young Swedenborg, and the question is, some new church people think that basically Swedenborg wrote the theological works, and before that he was sort of a theological tabula rasa, a blank slate, to use John Locke's expression. For, we know nothing, we're completely empty, ignorant. And Swedenborg knows nothing about this stuff, and all of a sudden the Lord commissions him in 1749. Away he goes. It's almost like automatic writing or something. So there's that. Then we get to the idea that, okay, he's a blank slate, and then you get the theological works, and then he switches over to writing about theology. Or is Swedenborg's pre-theological, scientific and philosophical work, is that informed by things that went before him? Like other philosophers, like other scientists. Was he looking at this stuff? And the answer to that is very easy. It's clear that he was drawing on lots of what had gone before him. But I've still got a blue arrow and a red arrow. But let's talk about the first scenario here. Maybe people who are fans of Swedenborg's theological works don't care about what went before. Maybe that's a clean break. Whatever he was thinking before, now he's doing entirely new stuff. The Lord's inspired him. Why do we need to know anything about that? And let's see. I want to talk about an additional scenario where you've got a divine inspiration, as it were, even of the pre-theological works. Now, why would anybody think of that? Well, Swedenborg wrote this, notice this work here is called the Mechanism of the Operation of the Soul and the Body. Mechanism is in the title, and soul and body. This work is, well, this is strangely the title page, or the lack of the title page, of the shortest work of the 18 published works of the theological works. And I'm going to give you a close-up on the title there. Can you see that now? I mean, it's Latin, so you probably can't piece it out anyway. De commercio animae et corporis. The commerce of the soul and the body, sometimes called the intercourse of the soul and the body, simply sometimes influx. And that is to be either by physical influx, or by spiritual influx, or by pre-established harmony. So there's three choices here. And here is a more modern cover for this same work. All right, so in this work, Swedenborg, at the end, this is the last passage in the work, number 20, and we're already at the end. I was once asked how, from a philosopher, I became a theologian, and I answered in the same way that fishermen were made disciples and apostles by the Lord, and that I also, from early youth, had been a spiritual fisherman. On hearing this, the inquirer asked, "What is a spiritual fisherman?" I replied that a fisherman, in the spiritual sense of the word, signifies a man who investigates and teaches, get this, natural truths, and afterwards, spiritual truths rationally. Let's do that again. We got the fisherman. In the spiritual sense of the word, signifies a man who investigates and teaches natural truths, and afterwards spiritual truths rationally. So some people have actually landed on that like a duck on a June bug and said, see, what he was saying before was also the truth. Natural truths. He goes on to truths about the spiritual world and spiritual principles, but here he's doing the truth about natural things. I mean, people have been committed to this idea that he could do no wrong. As a matter of fact, you know the concept of the Immaculate Conception. This is a little risky, but not to be confused with, of course, not to be confused with the virgin birth. Virgin birth is that Jesus was conceived of a virgin. The Immaculate Conception is the idea that St. Anne, who is in Christian tradition the mother of Mary, conceived Mary without sin. Catholic Church teaches Mary was conceived by normal biological means in the womb of her mother, St. Anne, but God acted upon her soul, keeping it immaculate, so that Mary herself was the mother of Jesus, but she imparted no evil to him, no hereditary evil. This is directly contrary to New Church doctrine, by the way, because she herself was conceived without sin. And some people, I didn't make this up, some people, I actually kind of partial to it, but I didn't make it up. The idea that there's kind of a parallel with Swedenborg, and some people thinking that somehow Swedenborg could do no wrong, Swedenborg could have no fault in his thinking, even prior to the theological period. But, so that's the one side of the argument, right? Swedenborg was prepared by natural truths. So everything he knew and everything he thought and everything he wrote must be the truth about cosmology and anatomy and all those things. This might go a little overboard. I don't know if I know anybody who subscribes to that theory anymore. Evidence on the other side. I just gave you the canonical passage, ISB 20. Now let's turn to true Christian religion. Swedenborg, at the end of the section on creation, has a little memorable relation talking to angels And they respond, we from our place perceive that you were meditating on the creation of the universe on several occasions. We have considered the same subject. We have not been able to come to any definite conclusion because our ideas were obsessed with the idea of chaos. We have therefore called you from the place where you were, that you might give us the results of your meditation on the subject. I long considered this matter, but in vain, he says. Now that, you can see, I not only got it quoted, but I'm underlining it. But after I was admitted by the Lord into your world, I perceived it is vain to form any conclusion about the creation of the universe unless it is first known that there are two worlds. And it goes on. Right? So I see a pretty clear indication here that Swedenborg is saying, before I was introduced into the spiritual world, I was muddle-headed about the relationship of the two worlds and the creation, even of the natural world. And you got to know a bunch of stuff before you're ready to do that. Back to the ISB number, right at the beginning, it lays out some of these things we have to know. It's very like TCR 75, right before the one I just read, gives you a catalog of things you need to know to understand creation. These things cannot be explained except by one to whom it has been granted by the Lord to associate with angels in the spiritual world at the same time with men in the natural world, being in two worlds at the same time. So he's having these conversations with angels, as this book says. Continuing. Because this has been granted to me, I've been able to describe both the spiritual and the natural in their nature, which has been done in the work on conjugal love. The spiritual is described there in the relation, the human soul, and influx. So what do we need to know? There's a bunch of things. Spiritual influx, two worlds. Spiritual world existed, subsists from its sun, the spiritual sun, and so on. There's a list of things you need to know before you can really understand creation. So back to 75, which came right before the relation I read about Swedenborg. I reasoned in vain, says he. No one can gain a right idea of the creation of the universe until his understanding is brought into the state of perception by some most general knowledge as previously recognized, which are as follows. Pretty much the same catalog we were just seeing in ISB 2. There they are, lined up. You can see similar idea. But to know the manner in which this life and wisdom flow in is infinitely above the sphere of human mind. There is no analysis and no abstraction can reach so high. The only representation we can have by way of comparison with the light, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing here. It's just there's your elaboration, and finally we get down to the one sun is within nature, the other above it. Two distinct realms. And Swedenborg didn't fully grasp that any time before he was admitted into the spiritual world. But he does actually talk in this language. He speaks about it in the economy of the animal kingdom. He wasn't really there because he hadn't really experienced both worlds in a conscious way, but he's already seeing that needs to be done, even in the economy of the animal kingdom. Or the dynamics of the soul's domain. So there is a bridge. There are these bridges, and that's the last piece. So piece one, there are people, or were people in the history of the thought about Swedenborg who said, well, Swedenborg had to be speaking the truth about natural things. He couldn't have had any falsities. And then there are people who say, he was just muddle-headed. He didn't know what he was talking about. We should just focus on the theological works and ignore the stuff that goes before. And here I'm trying to make the argument that it's not an immaculate conception of ideas which are without flaw, but they are important background to understanding some of the things in the theological works. Okay. There are 3 degrees. That's one of the things you got to know. We have need, therefore, of some science to serve as our guide in tracing her steps, to arrange all things into series, to distinguish the series in degrees, to contemplate the order of each thing and the order of the whole. The science which does this I call the science of series and degrees, or the doctrine of order. Divine love and wisdom. You should be able to anticipate me on this one at this point, right? that is also the economy of the animal kingdom, dynamics of the soul's domain. So he's already elaborating the series of degrees, which is one of the things you need to know to understand the creation of the natural world, the relationship of the spiritual and the natural. Okay, back to the interaction between the soul and the body. There are these three theories: physical influx, spiritual influx, and pre-established harmony. So you've got soul and you got body. How are they connected, if at all? Maybe there is no soul. Maybe there's just a body, and we have the illusion of having a soul. Do I have a... Wait, okay. Pre-established harmony is the idea there's a soul and there's a body, but there's no connection between them. And it's like two clocks, and they look like they might be connected because they keep time at the same rate, but they just got wound up together and set going with the same starting point. That's one of the theories. So, spiritual influx, physical influx, pre-established harmony. Back to the ISB, not 20, the last one, but the next to last passage, he tells a little story. One of the memorable relations, the memorable relation in this work. After these things were written, I prayed to the Lord that I might be permitted to converse with the disciples of Aristotle, at the same time the disciples of Descartes, and with the disciples of Leibniz. And these guys line up with those different theories. And in addition, we've got Leibniz, and on his at the skirt of his garment was Christian Wolff, who was an author. Swedenborg was a big fan of Christian Wolff. He had his Psychologia Empirica, Psychologia Rationalis, and so he wrote a rational psychology. The Oxford English Dictionary says Wolff is the first person to use the term psychology, or the Latin equivalent psychologia, in the modern sense of the study of the mind. Before that, it was the Department of Theology studying the soul. And Swedenborg picks right up on this. He's got these books hot off the press, and he's writing his own responses to what Christian Wolff has to say about them. Okay, so let's review these different theories. We've got the physical influx idea, that the soul is kind of projection of the body, and Aristotle's the one who was associated with that. Swedenborg said Aristotle, Descartes, and Leibniz. And here's the Aristotle theory. That's meant to be Aristotle with Plato. Plato is saying, no, there's stuff up there, and Aristotle is kind of like, let's stick to what's here. Famous painting of the School of Athens, and the two philosophers represented in that way. Then we've got Descartes. And I don't know why I don't have an arrow on that one, but that should be going down. And then the pre-established, I don't know where my arrows went. That one should go, no arrow, there should be a bar between these. So what happens? He got the followers of these three, and we have a contest, and they have a lottery, or a drawing of lots, to figure out which one is right. Then they chose one of their number to draw, and putting in his hand, he took hold of that on which was written spiritual influx. That's the Cartesian theory. Well, that's a lucky chance. But then he says, then an angel suddenly stood by and said, do you not believe that the paper in favor of spiritual influx came out by chance, but from providence? Do not believe that it came out by chance, but from providence. For you do not see its truth because you are in confused idea, but the truth itself presented itself to the hand of him who drew the lots, that you might favor it. So, it wins the contest. Why am I talking about this? It's a philosophical idea that was out there, a question that existed in Swedenborg's day, but back to the economy of the animal kingdom. There's the series and degrees. And as we get into this, he says, well, there's three possible ways to look at it. Physical influx, occasional causes, or pre-established harmony. He's calling it occasional causes here, but it's Descartes' theory. Three theories. Pre-established harmony is mentioned last in both cases. Direct parallel here between what is said in 1769 at the end of the theological period and the account that he gives in the economy of the animal kingdom. Preface to the introduction of the rational psychology, we get the series and degrees. So what? What am I trying to do with that? I'm trying to say that he got this stuff from Wolff. The idea of Wolff believed in pre-established harmony, but he got the whole layout here of there's these three theories right out of Wolff's rational psychology. So that's my case for. It's not completely revealed truth in the pre-theological works, but on the other hand, you need them for background for a number of things in the theological works. So, turning to the early work of the Swedenborg Scientific Association. At first, they were focused a lot on publishing and expounding what they were publishing. So get these works in print, keep these works in print, make sure there's Latin editions if possible, translate those into English, and then let's start explaining. Principia Club, I mentioned that a while back. The Principia Club got interested in this, and then we got the Swedenborg Scientific Association. At the Principia Club, one of the leading figures, one of the figures who brought a lot of energy to it, was Lillian Beekman. And so this is an important part of the story here. She was one of the instigators for the study of Swedenborg's philosophy and science, and she belonged to that group that kind of looked on it as a revealed science for the new church. W.F. Pendleton, the bishop of the General Church at that point, was another one. He gave a talk on the future of the academy, and he said, where are we going to get new church science? We got Swedenborg's works, which will give us the foundation of a new church science. So they were extremely excited about this stuff at that point, and that was the atmosphere into which the Swedenborg Scientific Association was launched. So she's one leading figure. Another leading figure in the early days was Right Reverend Dr. Alfred Acton. I swiped this image from the portrait in the Swedenborgiana Library, and very fitting it should be in the Swedenborgiana Library. So, what was Beekman doing? She was not doing the translating or the publishing. She was doing the expounding part. And I don't think you can probably read the tiny print here, but this is a solar vortex. This is an illustration from her book, Swedenborg's Cosmology. So she's got Swedenborg's Cosmology. She's got the return kingdom of the Lord's proceeding. She's got the Principia and spectrum analysis. She's spinning out all kinds of things. Everybody's very excited about this. I'm going to tell a personal little story here. Many years ago, 1991, I'm writing a paper on the human divine for the Council of the Clergy. I'm seeing some papers in the archives that look interesting. 1911, they're writing about the Lord's incarnation, the Lord coming into the world. I see 4 papers I'm interested in, so I write to the archives from Michigan, where I was living at that point, and they say, do you want the 5th paper that was delivered to the council? I said, I didn't see a 5th paper in the index. They said the 5th paper delivered to the council on the Lord's incarnation at that point was by Lillian Beekman. And she was explaining the Lord's incarnation in terms of the Principia cosmology, with the first finites here and the passives here, and the whole machinery of the Principia brought to bear on the theology of the Lord's incarnation. There's another illustration. It looks like a spring maybe, but that's meant to be a model of a solar vortex. So people were into making models of these things. Some of them we still have down in the Swedenborgiana Library. You may have seen these things. There's some mining machinery. There's the famous model of the airplane. We've got an artist's conception out there of Swedenborg drawing the plans right off of the commons there. All right, so that's what she was doing, the expounding. Alfred Acton devoted much time and energy to translating and publishing such manuscripts as had not yet been published, like, as I mentioned, the Cerebrum. That's one of the books, which is in this series. I don't have that particular one here. It's out there on one of the tables. That's the modern cover with the pretty picture, etc. I just want to throw in, these are 2 major things that they were doing at this point, but I want to go back for a moment and mention Frank Sewell again, convention minister. So one of the points I wanted to make, while they were doing this work, there was a lot of activity here in Bryn Athyn. Alfred Acton, Lillian Beekman was here. But the Swedenborg Scientific Association had a broader scope than this because it had members not just from the general church, but from other new church organizations. The first president, Frank Sewell, was a prominent convention minister. And there continue to be other people out there doing the work of the association. I want to mention one other example here, and that is J.R. Swanton, who wrote a book called Emanuel Swedenborg, The Prophet of Higher Evolution. He was in Washington also. He worked at the Smithsonian. He was an ethnographer. You look him up on the internet, you're going to find a lot of publications on the Native Americans by Swanton in the 1920s or so. But he was also active in the Swedenborg Scientific Association. There were people who were interested in science and the doctrines, and I say science and the doctrines, and that gets us to kind of a new stage. As we go along, here's a few more I thought I'd mention. I don't have their names on there. That's Dr. Hugo Oedner. E.E. Unerick, he did a lot of the translating. He did the Psychologica, and he did some draft translations of other things that weren't published. And C.T. Oedner, Hugo's uncle, was one of the people who questioned the Beekman theory that that basically Swedenborg science was the truth about reality. And at that point, there was kind of a backlash. And people say, oh, people didn't like Lillian Beekman because she was a woman. But the real backlash was against the idea of sort of the infallibility of Swedenborg's pre-theological works. And she sort of got swept along with that backlash, and the pendulum, I believe, swung too far the other way. And people say, let's not even talk about those things anymore. They didn't come to a sort of a balance of there's useful things to be said here. And some of these people were still promoting that, the idea of the usefulness, even though they aren't gospel, as it were. So I would, as we come into this new era, I would point out, for instance, this little, I thought I had it here. It's out on the table. Hugo Oedner's Principles of the New Philosophy. So what are they going to be? They're going to be Principia, means conducing to the true philosophy, series and degrees from the economy, that kind of thing. No, that's not what it is. It is doctrinal principles from the published theological works brought to bear on creating a new philosophy. So that's a significant shift in the focus of the Swedenborg Scientific Association and the new philosophy. And so we're coming on towards the present now, finally. And I just wanted to mention a few people. There probably aren't many here who wouldn't recognize Edward Allen over there, who was the editor of New Philosophy for a long time. He taught Swedenborg's pre-theological works, but he wrote a lot about philosophy from, he also taught New Church philosophy based on divine love and wisdom. So he had irons in both fires, and a lot of what he published in the New Philosophy himself, written by himself and written by others, was not strictly drawn from the pre-theological works. Some of it had nothing to do, no mention of the pre-theological works. I mentioned Hugo Oedner with the Principles of New Philosophy. I also wanted to mention the human mind. It's got some material from rational psychology, but it's mostly published by the SSA, but it's mostly from the theological works. Imagination and Rationality by George DeCharms. Again, largely from the theological works, a little intermingling of pre-theological stuff, but reprinted from New Philosophy by Swedenborg Scientific Association. Do you see the shift here? Edward Allen was part of that shift. Charles Cole was part of that shift. Boyd Osplin was part of that shift, right? He's writing about natural law, right? The article in New Philosophy about natural law. And the reins went from Edward Allen to Leonard Alfelt, who again encouraged all kinds of things. I think it was under Leonard's editorship we got a department called Translator's Corner. And it wasn't about translating the pre-theological works. It was about translating the theological works. So we have Swedenborg's Neo-Latin. The new philosophy emerged as a scholarly or academic journal for new church thought, not excluding the pre-theological, but no requirement that be included. Okay. Charles Cole, longtime president of the Swedenborg Scientific Association and presiding over it as it made this shift. Edward Allen, the editor of New Philosophy, while it was undergoing this shift. Leonard Ohlfeldt continuing and another stalwart in this cause. The editor since then, for many years, has been our own esteemed Erland Brock. Okay, I've got Dan Goodnow here. He was a player in the Swedenborg Scientific Association, but I want to mention him as another example here of the kind of thing we've got going on here. Published by the SSA, we have Divine Providence and Free Will in Human Actions. And we got, you can't read them obviously, but there are footnotes, 119 through 129. We've got, I wanted to count the footnotes here. Over 200 footnotes, close to 300 footnotes, and almost all of them from the theological works, not the pre-theological works. Not that there's anything wrong with those, but here we have something, the work supported by the SSA, published by the SSA, about applying doctrine to the idea of history. That's really what that is about, is history. And so, we go all over the place. Translation, history, language, and yes, philosophy, but philosophy how? I mentioned the three scenarios about Swedenborg and the transition from what went before Swedenborg through the pre-theological works to the theological works. I want to talk about a similar pattern of three scenarios, three new scenarios that go out the other side of the picture. Okay, I'm going to stretch the timeline out beyond Swedenborg, and I'm going to say what might people be interested in? They might be interested in Swedenborg's influence, whether or not it's acknowledged, whether it's simply permeated. Do the theological works, that's the red arrow, theological works have an impact on people's thinking. People might be interested to think about, okay, but there are things in the pre-theological works which lead into the theological works, which then become influential. The doctrine of correspondences begins in the pre-theological works. And there are people who are influenced by both together. They've got Swedenborg's pre-theological works and his theological works on the shelf. And there's also the possibility that people are interested in the influence of the pre-theological works on other people. This would be like the Kant-Laplace idea that the solar hypothesis somehow came from Swedenborg and got to other people. So people are looking at all three of these things at this day. And not only people looking at these things, but this is the shift in mission, the shift in perspective of not only the New Philosophy, the journal, but the Swedenborg Scientific Association as well. And so my last exhibit here, I think I've paraded down my whole wall of books. We had thought originally when we scheduled this book fair, we might have Reuben Bell with us. Here is a fat manuscript by Reuben Bell called Intelligent Default, Emanuel Swedenborg's Theistic Science as a Model and Method for Solving Contemporary Problems in Natural Philosophy. So it's got a lot of stuff here, but I mean, I open at random. Divine Love and Wisdom, True Christian Religion. Reuben Bell is our current president of the Swedenborg Scientific Association, and he is very much into this kind of thing, where we want to see the influence of sort of the combination of the pre-theological and the theological works, or even just the theological, but we're gonna be looking for the other as well, where we have themes from the pre-theological through the theological and finally into other influence, and also just the pre-theological works themselves influencing things or being sources we can draw on for informing the thought of the future. This is my picture of the future of the Swedenborg Scientific Association and the New Philosophy, and I think it is the shared vision of those who are still doing the work of the Swedenborg Scientific Association. One of the sponsors of the book expo here, and so some of our publications most of our publications are out there available. Should you be interested? Many more than what I've got here. And at that point, I'm going to close and see if there's any questions. I said it all. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit. Is this working? I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about New Church methodology for the study of the social sciences. If there's been, if there were significant contributions to that early on, and if that's kind of in the area or in the focus of the Swedenborg Scientific Association. I'm thinking particularly of things like anthropology and psychology, possibly economics.
Well, you threw in psychology, and until you said psychology, I was going to say very little. Even though, I mean, Swanton, I mentioned John Swanton, Swedenborg, the prophet of higher evolution. So he's trying to connect with evolutionary theory, which is, that's part of anthropology. I mean, we're talking about human evolution, but very little, generally speaking, until I would say the 1950s, when you begin to get people publishing in New Philosophy on subjects like history. And I tend to think of Dan Goodnow as why that was just last year, but I think this is 1975 maybe. No, what says 86? I'm actually going the wrong direction. I usually guess more recent. So that's about history. That's the main. It's not just a theological treatise. Dan Goodnow taught history. He had a degree in church history, and so he's interested in how the teachings of divine providence bear on history. William Kentner he published a book, but he had things in New Philosophy too about history. So we've got history and other anthropology. We get things about human evolution. We get more things about that into the 1970s. So that's beginning to show itself. 50s, 60s, 70s, we're getting history, anthropology. Psychology, we've got stuff going back. We got to talk about human psychology going back to rational psychology, De Anima, Sewell's introduction here, late 19th century. So psychology is sort of a special case amongst the social sciences because it's so directly addressed in some of Swedenborg's works. But other than that, the implications of things, particularly the implications in the theological works, are only begin to be drawn out in the last half century or so. Yes, sir. Well, one of the hats I wear is teaching Swedenborg's philosophy, and we don't get big crowds of people teaching it. But a number of the students who get exposed to Swedenborg's philosophy said, I had no idea, that kind of thing. And so I don't really have an answer for how to get the word out. There's so many things for young people to be looking at, and I don't know how to get the captive audience to get them to sit still long enough to introduce a lot of these concepts. Yes?
I was just thinking how Swedenborg himself was educated, kind of thing. That
Well, another little piece, I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but one of the things that set the stage for Swedenborg's education at Uppsala University was what they called the Cartesian controversy. And the Cartesians were against the Aristotelians, and the Aristotelians basically had their science and philosophy wedded to Christian doctrine. And the Cartesians were the modern scientifically minded people who said, let's look at empirical evidence, let's do science this way. And they kind of came to a truce, but the old guard had kind of, the balance went towards them. So this was a struggle in Uppsala right before Swedenborg's time. He would have been aware of the aftermath of that. And my point is that, but in his day, there was a lot of integration of the theology into the science, and he was trying to do the same kind of thing. But it's certainly not part of the modern educational model. It's like, as Stephen Jay Gould would say, these are independent magisteria. Science does its thing, theology does its thing, and you theology people can do your thing over there, but leave us alone, and we'll do our thing over here, and we will leave you alone. And that's the modern outlook, I think, on the relationship of the study of religion and the study of science. And so the kind of world Swedenborg was living in, it was entirely different. And we're making little efforts. I think it's going to take some time to figure out how to do more of this kind of thing, where we take the doctrines and we see, not just here is. It's not nearly so easy as they thought back in 1901, when they thought, here's new church science ready packaged in Swedenborg's philosophical works. It ain't that simple. We need to draw principles from the doctrines, some of which got first enunciated in the pre-theological works, and see how they apply to the subjects that we study. So we've got that with history there, and I teach a course also on the human mind. And I use this text, which draws a little bit from the rational psychology, but it's principles from the doctrines that bear on a lot of the modern issues in psychology. Well, I think probably with that, you have a question?
He asked my question.
Okay, good, brilliant. I think at that point we'll wrap it up. Thank you.